In this video, I'm going to show you how to create an Umber underpainting, but first we're going to talk about Imprimatura, and I'll do a demonstration on creating the Imprimatura layer, the first layer of color. In the PowerPoint presentation, we talked about Imprimatura being the initial layer of color to tone down the harsh white of the gesso. I have two colors that I'm going to use to approximate the yellow ochre. I have a sheet of canvas pad paper that I've taped down, which is not really necessary, but I'm going to be using broad strokes from left to right and going beyond the edges of the paper, so I just wanted to keep the tabletop clear. I have water to dilute the paint and paper towels. You should have everything that you need handy just in case before you start. Now, I'm using acrylic because it dries fast and because it's perfectly acceptable to work with oils on top of acrylic. I'm going to create the Imprimatura layer using acrylic. Once that dries, I'm going to demonstrate how to create an umber underpainting, but I'll be using oils for that. You can create an Imprimatura layer with oils. That's not a problem at all. It's just that this is more convenient for me while I film these videos. To create an Imprimatura layer with oils, you want to use odorless mineral spirits or turpentine, but you want to make sure that you have good ventilation when you do that. And use that to dilute the oil so that it's a transparent wash and it flows nicely across the surface. I'm using two colors that are included in the palette for this class. That palette is purposefully limited. It's called a limited palette, and it's meant to teach students how to mix colors and to show you that you can mix a broad range of colors using just the primaries and burnt umber and white, and we also have black included in on our supply list. But here I'm going to be using lemon yellow, which is a cool yellow, and burnt umber, which is an earth tone, the only earth tone in our palette. And what I'd like to do is approximate like a yellow ochre color, so a little less umber and a little more yellow. And then I start mixing and adding water. And you want to make sure you have enough color mixed up and diluted to cover the surface. And you'll need a fair amount of water. Also make sure that it's mixed well. You can also mix this in a small cup. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'm mixing it right on the palette paper. So here we have something that begins to approximate a yellow ochre, an earth tone. And I think it might be ready to begin applying. Again, this is a fairly straightforward process. Nothing too complicated about it. The complicated stuff will come later, trust me. And we can begin applying the Imprimatura layer to the canvas pad. A general rule of thumb when painting is to work lean to fat, and that's what we're doing. We're employing the indirect painting technique, and we'll talk more about that. And that's also included in the PowerPoint presentation. But again, the general rule of thumb when working with oil paints is to work lean to fat, meaning that we work from thin layers with little or no linseed oil or oil content. So our umber underpainting is going to be made using just burnt umber and mineral spirits or turpentine. Well, that's pretty much it. I don't think I really need to do much else. If you had a canvas, you can move it around a little bit and try to even out some of those lines, but they might even out a bit on their own. Also, if you have a bigger brush, that would be helpful also, just to go over it and even it out. But keep in mind that there are going to be a lot of layers that go on top of this, so if it's a little uneven, it's not a big problem, but for the most part, it looks pretty good. Now back to the lean to fat rule. Indirect painting means that we're building paintings in successive steps using many layers. At the beginning, those layers should be thin and should not contain oil content, no linseed oil, just turpentine or mineral spirits and pigment. And that's how we'll create our umber underpainting. When we get to the color layers, the paint itself has as a vehicle linseed oil or safflower oil, linseed oil being the most common oil used in paint, in oil paint. So right there, you're starting to add a little bit of the fat content to the paint, but at that point you have a stable surface. Your Imprimatura is stable and your Umber Underpainting is stable. It's not a thick layer of paint on top of which you can add your color layers, which do contain more of the oil content. So lean to fat. Keep that in mind. And we are finished with the Imprimatura layer. I'm going to let that dry, pull off the tape, and set up for the next demo. All right, so now that we've done the Imprimatura layer, we'll begin the Umber Underpainting. I've turned my canvas pad vertically to better suit the orientation of the subject. That's something you should think about before you begin a painting, whether to work horizontally or vertically. I have palette paper. I'm going to use oils, so I have a tube of burnt umber, mineral spirits, OMS, odorless mineral spirits, and 3 brushes, round brushes of different sizes. I like round brushes. They're very versatile, and believe me, good brushes and small rounds of good quality will make your life so much easier when it comes time to filling in details. So to begin, I've already, as you can see, created the underdrawing on top of the Imprimatura. If you're using oils for your Imprimatura, you have to make sure it's absolutely dry before you begin. And with acrylic, the same thing, but acrylic takes 5 minutes to dry, so this surface is already dry. And again, working with oils over acrylics is perfectly fine. So I'm going to begin by just squeezing out a bit of paint onto the palette paper. And from there, to lighten the values, I simply add more mineral spirits to the paint. The paint is more transparent and the values will look a little lighter as a result. For the darkest values, you use the paint full strength. An umber underpainting can be done in several stages. For example, I could work on this for 15 minutes and let it dry and come back to add more details and make it a little crisper and sharper in terms of the details and the brushwork and the contours and things like that. Or it could be done. It could be something that's done in one shot and is fairly loose, as we saw in the PowerPoint presentation. Because with each successive stage, you'll be refining and cleaning things up and adding details. So I'll begin by adding some mineral spirits to the paint, and maybe, as I mentioned earlier, I like to begin at the top left or on the left-hand side. And what I'm shooting for here is approximating the values that I see. I have the bottle, green bottle, but we want to kind of squint our eyes and look at the values that are contained within the lights and darks, and begin working with that. There's a lot of reflections and highlights. So if you're starting out with painting, it might not be the best idea to use a bottle or things that have reflective surfaces, because they do pose a challenge. Now, I'm all for challenging myself as an artist, but when you're starting out, it's a good idea to keep things simple and take it a step at a time. But here what I'm doing is looking at those different highlights and reflections and trying to work around them with the brush and the value and the burnt umber, and just letting the canvas show through where those highlights are brightest or lightest. The nice thing about using using the oil and the mineral spirits is that if you want to lighten something up, you can use a dry brush and manipulate the paint. Or if you want to wipe something away, you can use your paper towel, or if you're using rags, same thing. You can wipe away any mistakes or create adjustments in terms of values and tones using your paper towel or your rags. So basically we just work our way down and block in and looking very carefully. One thing I want to stress is that when we're painting, we should, in a certain sense, forget what it is that we're looking at and just really kind of focus on the abstract forms and shapes and their colors and values and things like that. There's transparency to this bottle, obviously, which is something that, again, if you don't capture everything during the underpainting phase, you can definitely fill it in later, because you still have your color layer to go, and especially when it comes to things like this bottle and the reflective layers and the different reflections, glazing, the glaze layer, that's when you can really take care of business. So painting, in some ways, this is a little bit like watercolor painting, in that you dilute the paint more in order to create lighter tones, allowing more of the canvas to show through. And you can see that now I'm using a kind of a mopping motion to spread the paint out a little more thinly, allowing more of the paper to show through because there's kind of a light area back there. This bottle is definitely something that might require 2 or 3 passes to get all that information down, the translucency, the reflections, and so on. But we don't have that luxury here. We want to keep this video somewhat short, and just to get the message across, of course. Paper towel, as you can see, I dip the brush in paint and wipe off excess when I need to, or if I need to. Darken things if I need to. Make adjustments. Now the indirect painting technique, which is what we're teaching here, again, building up a painting using successive layers. And every step of the way, you can make refinements and changes and adjustments. And that's the idea, that with each layer, you should be making the layer that comes next, the step that comes next, easier. So here in the underpainting phase, we're laying down our value structure. And this can be extremely loose and general, or it can be super tight and detailed. And the tighter and more detailed it is, the easier it'll be. But it really depends on your painting style. And again, with each step that comes, you make changes. What I need to do is, I'm looking at this, I need to bring up these little reflections up here, and I can do that. I can do that a little bit later. Okay, so we continue painting, make adjustments every step of the way. Again, making each successive layer a little bit easier for ourselves. Let's fill in and just let's get this done. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this. You just want to get the idea of what it takes. What an Umber underpainting is. It's going to become a little looser for the sake of saving time. We have a nice dark shadow down here. We can add paint at almost full strength. And some details in here, things like that. All right. So I think with this, we can probably move on and begin working with the pear, working on the pear. General midtones. Light source is off to the left, upper left. So we have cast shadows going off to the right. So that was a consideration when I began placing the objects on the canvas. The bottle is off to the left, so we can include some of the cast shadow, which again has that kind of L shape that we talked about in the PowerPoint, which is a nice way of balancing a painting. As I mentioned, this is going to get a little bit loose for the sake of getting it. There's a lot of blemishes and texture, visual texture on that pear, so I approximate that by using the tip of the brush and tapping on the surface to create those marks. Now, there's only so much you can do while the paint is wet. And in terms of details like that, all those little marks and things, I mean, you can begin to add them now and approximate them. But it's also very helpful and actually easier to wait until the paint dries and then add those fine details. And even this stem got a little heavy towards the bottom, but that can be fixed when I start to block in the background. I can make adjustments to the contours. I can thin out the stem. I can do a lot of things during that step when I begin to block it in with the opaque paint layers. And we'll get that cast shadow in there quickly, which is a little bit lighter than the information here. I want to get a slightly darker value on the right-hand side of that pear. It shouldn't be too dark, but I do want to differentiate it from the cast shadow. And working with loose brush strokes to create the texture that I see there. And then block in the cast shadow. Get that in there quickly. Let that go off the edge. Darker shadows under the object. We have that here. I like to get a little bit of clarity between, there's a pencil, between the left side of the pear and the bottle. And I can also just lighten that up by going into it with a dry brush and picking up some of that. Or tapping it with the paper towel. Lifting up some of the paint so you get a lighter value as a result. And you can use this actually as part of your painting process. Okay, so at this point, the only thing left to do really, if you need to do it, is to block in some of the background information, but it's very light and loose. It's just a white backdrop with some wrinkles and things like that. But it does create the setting. So in our paintings, we always have a background and foreground that we need to fill in. And it really gives the painting more of more life and more of an environment that puts everything into context. So we do want to include that as well in our underpainting. Some still I set up some more complex than others, and if you had, for example, this set up in front of a, let's say, a bookshelf or something like that, then you would be spending a lot more time on the backdrop and incorporating a lot more detail. So, but here it's just well, it's kind of like a studio, photo studio setup with a strong light source on a blank white backdrop. And I can work a little bit to lighten some of that information where I need to. Lighten it up around here, back here, and just really what you want in this case is a general layout or value structure of the shadows, lights and darks.